Okay, yeah, Jacob Ideskog. I'm going to talk a bit about OAuth and OpenID Connect, as I usually do, but today we're going to zoom in a bit on what's next. Like Bill said, we've been living with this for a year, almost a decade now, and the world isn't the same, and the standards aren't the same, and what's happening. So let's start by looking back a bit. 2012, 8 years ago. Apple, they just released the iPhone 5. There were 750,000 apps on the App Store already 2012, and 20 billion downloads that year only. And 20 billion downloads is actually as much as all the years together before that. So we're really like hitting the hockey stick there. When it comes to Android, it's pretty similar. We're looking at the Galaxy S3 from Samsung, Android, roughly version 4, and almost the same amount of apps on the App Store, almost the same amount of downloads. So we're looking at a pretty big explosion. And what this means for us in the API space is that this is when the API universe is starting to explode. We saw that app to API communication is the big thing now. Obviously, because the way apps are being built is quickly transforming from being a sort of a monolithic app to something that communicates with the backend. Most logic, most data, everything is stored elsewhere, and the app is becoming a thin client. Obviously, it works very well for mobile scenarios. So this is changing rapidly. And we're seeing this both for first-party and third-party apps, both the homegrown ones for our own company and others using our APIs or us using others' APIs. And this is when OAuth enters the picture. This is 2012. That's when OAuth 2.0 was ratified. There was obviously OAuth 1 before that, but that didn't really take off in the mobile space as much, and for various reasons. But OAuth 2 made quite a good success story all the way from the start. And it's good to know that OAuth 2 was really designed as a framework rather than a standard. It's meant to be built upon, to be improved. And what OAuth 2 solves, I'm not going to go through the details in this talk, but essentially it solves the problem that David was mentioning here. How do I get an app to communicate with an API in a way that the API knows who that app is, who the caller is? But specifically, how do we involve the user in this? Because we don't trust the app necessarily. So we don't want the app to see the user's credentials. The user has an account with an OAuth server. So we involve an OAuth server to delegate access to the app so the app can call the API. And we use something called access tokens to ship this information around, or this data around. But pretty soon we found, we could call them shortcomings. We can also say that they were intentional, some of them. But there were things that the spec simply didn't cover, and the use cases were bigger than the spec. So when it came to mobile, pretty soon there were security issues found. There were UX pains pretty early on, and I'll go through those a bit because they're not insignificant. And in other areas, we had the emergence of single page applications. These weren't a big thing 2012. These are the browser-only applications, React, Vue, and those type of things. And there were other assumptions made around access tokens, and so that works in most cases, but not all cases. So more things were needed. So when you start looking at these type of problems that OAuth is trying to address, it sounds pretty easy. We have an API and we have a client, and we somehow need to delegate access between the two. But then you realize, but the app, it could be a mobile app, but it could be a browser app, it could be a single page app, it could be a TV, set-top box, it could be a server, it could be a kiosk. There's a lot of different types of devices to begin with, or clients. But there's also different ways in which these interact with APIs, and the sort of level of security that is required for an app to communicate or to retrieve data from a particular API. I mean, we have Very big difference, obviously, between a banking grade API and a weather API. So there's a lot of nuances and variants in the OAuth flows. And what this meant was that, well, the good old OAuth spec very, very quickly was accompanied by other specifications. And this is normal in IETF. This is how it usually works. But in OAuth, it grew quite quickly to quite a lot of specs. And these are just a few. So we have specs for dynamically registering clients or apps. We have specs for revocation of tokens, how to use JSON Web Tokens. That's not part of the core spec. We have how to use assertions and how to constrain tokens to get more secure access tokens and to constrain tokens using mutual TLS. And like I mentioned, also there was these problems with mobile applications security-wise. So the PKCE or PKCE standard or spec was added to solve that, together with the native app best current practice, which explains how to do mobile development with OAuth. And same thing, single page best current practice. So there's a lot of these things, a lot of these specs being added to it. And why am I listing all of this? Well, we have OAuth 2, and obviously, what's the purpose of a spec? Well, it's interoperability. So when somebody asks, do you support OAuth 2? And you say, yes, both of you should know. Okay, great, then we can work together. But when OAuth 2 means a base spec and 30 other things on top in order to make it work properly, interoperability becomes a problem. So in this community, what's happening now is the modest step of OAuth 2.1 is being taken. And what that is simply a merge of all these specs, of all the relevant ones, all the important ones that are now considered to be, if we would have done OAuth now, these would have been in the core specification. Some things are removed that are considered not to be used anymore. There's still debates. It's not ready, OAuth 2.1. Some extensions are simply referenced from the base spec to make sure that it's clean. Like if you're going to do this, look there. But there's not a whole lot new things. I don't think there's anything new. Last time I checked, it's all of these things just put together in a nicer bundle. But what this will give us is interoperability. Now we can ask, do you support OAuth 2.1? And if someone says yes, then, okay, yeah, it's these things then I know I can do the mobile case like this and so on. So that's what we're looking at. So it sounds like it's not a whole lot of things happening. Well, there are other things. There's the GNAP or OAuth XYZ, which is very early stages where it's a transactional based OAuth being looked at. I'm not going to go into that today because it's too early on. So far. But what I wanted to mention and talk about a bit is what OAuth leaves out, and that's authentication, answering the question who you are. Authentication methods, or authenticators, they're called in some specs, are a way to answer the question, who are you, with some degree of certainty. You can send an email, click a link, you can visit Facebook and get a response, send an SMS, use some EID. You can use username, password, or some other secure app of some sort. All of these methods, we consider them islands. There's a way to log in using Facebook, and there's another way to log in using SMS, or there's probably a lot of ways to log in using SMS. There's no standard on like, how do I do this? How do I do that? That covers all authentication methods. There are standards covering each one, perhaps in some cases. But on top of OAuth, there was one standard added, which is OpenID Connect, and it unifies how to start and terminate the authentication flow. And that's pretty important still, even though it leaves a few things behind. So what OpenID was contributing with on top of OAuth was not anything to do with the API. It was something to do with the app itself and how I can request a login. How can I ask for, like, I want the user to have been by their device the last 30 minutes. I don't want to use an SSO session that's older than that, or I want to force a login right now, or I want this particular authentication method to be used, or those type of things. That's what OpenID adds. So it gives us a contract from an app to the OAuth or OpenID server then to ask for particulars when it comes to authentication. And it also gives us a standard way of understanding the result, which is an ID token explaining the user blah logged in this way that time. And this can be then used also for federation. And OpenID Connect is built on top of the framework standard OAuth. So anything OAuth was also given for free underneath, if you will. Why does that work? Why do we only need the start and the end? Well, so far, that's because we're using a browser. And a browser has some nice properties. First of all, most people are using one of 4 browsers: Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Edge. There's probably a few more that are very popular these days, but on the desktop, that's the ones. They enforce security in a very good way. They comply with security headers. They make sure cookies aren't sent to the wrong party, or that JavaScript can tamper with them when they're not supposed to. They make sure a redirect is followed without something interfering with that, or that a frame is shown on the correct origin. All of these things are things that a server can use to rely on the client to do things the right way. That's why we like browsers. They're generic like that from a security perspective. So when we're doing mobile, it's still a browser. So I mentioned UX before, and look at the UX here for mobile then for OpenID Connect. So when we want to start an OpenID Connect flow on a mobile device, it opens a browser, like a browser system browser perhaps, or something sliding in like a Chrome tab or Safari authentication session. And that contacts the OpenID Connect provider, which takes the user through a bunch of steps: enter your username, get an SMS, enter the OTP code, blah, blah, blah. And when it's done, it closes the browser usually and redirects back to the app. And the app can then use whatever code it got to redeem that and get the access token. This is a code flow in OAuth and OpenID Connect, abbreviated. But what if we use more things? So we open the browser, and then the OpenID Connect provider says, yeah, great, see your username. The next step is you're going to open another app, like an EID app, and do authentication there. And whoops, I didn't have that slide that I thought. And when that's done, it will close the app, and then it will close the browser and return. So we're looking at, we can start to understand, why is UX not always perfect here? Why doesn't this make up an award-winning app? So today, passwords are no longer the preferred way, if they ever were. But we have other means now of authentication that can serve instead of password. We have understood now that login is more than just enter a username, password, and get something back. It's a journey. You have to take the user through steps. We're using multi-factor authentication almost all the time, which means we're guiding the user for first do this, then click on every red light on this image, and then do that. So we're taking the authentication is a journey for the user. And we can use all these fancy things now, like key fobs and biometrics or Face ID and authentication apps. And state of the industry is that mobile developers still dislike the browser, just like they did 2012, the UX of that. There has been some attempts to do things, to improve things. In OpenID Connect, there's a standard called CIBA being worked on, client-initiated back-channel authentication. It's not particularly aiming at solving all of these problems I just mentioned, but it could be used for that. Essentially, it doesn't use a browser. So a device, an app, or whatever, it could be a kiosk or something, would call the OpenID server and say, hey, please authenticate user A for me. And the OpenID provider would then somehow call an app and have that app authenticate, and then in step 3 here, return some tokens to the user. That's CBA in a very short form. So that makes sense. It's pretty useful. You could use that for same device, switch between apps and stuff. But it doesn't really help us guide a user through a whole journey of multi-factors and stuff like that. It had to be, it's more contained than that. We call this the hamburger problem, the authentication hamburger. The authentication hamburger is a nice bun with a bunch of authentication methods in the middle. And what OpenID is really the top and the bottom bun here. And we're wondering, where's the beef? Because OpenID starts the flow, and then it comes to the middle. And in the middle, we perhaps start by asking for a username password, and then we send an email, and then we're done. So all of that has to be done. That's not part of the spec. So OpenID knows nothing about that. It just knows, I have these requirements, please make sure they work. So it's not standardized at all. And that works because we have a browser, like I mentioned before, because the browser has some nice properties of it. It guides the user. It presents something and the user knows what to do because it can read the text, it can see the images, it will click through and go to the next step. That's why the browser can be used in the middle here and is essentially the beef for OpenID Connect. But we don't like the browser. So if we just step back real quick and see, where are we and where do we need to go? Well, we've solved authentication requests. We know how to ask for it. We know how to tell the device, please authenticate like this. We know how to understand the result. Yeah, OpenID gives us both of those. And OAuth gave us API access. What we don't have is a native user experience here. We don't have a whole lot of ways for the user to control their own identity. I won't go into that today, but that's an important thing. We'll talk about more in other talks. And we don't have a generic way for combining arbitrary authentication methods. How do I combine username password with email, or not username password, a key fob with something else? We like to talk about API-driven authentication. We don't have the browser, so we need to emulate the browser. If we're going to do something for the poor mobile developers here, we need to solve this using hypermedia. Why? Well, first of all, like I said, hypermedia, if you don't know what that is, it is what the browser is doing. It does a request, it does a get to a server, and the web server responds with an HTML page, and that's a hypermedia format. So it shows you links and actions. What can you do on this page? So each response from the server tells you what you can do to get to the next place. So yes, there's a form here. I'll click submit. That's a post, and then I'll get another response with a new page. This is nice because authentication, when you think about it, is a state machine. You have a beginning and you have an end. So you begin, you enter your password, and then you request an OTP, and then you enter that OTP, and then you move on. Or you begin, you trigger another app, and then you simply wait and poll or wait for a push or whatever. And then once you receive that response, you're done. So authentication is really moving, or this user journey is a state machine on the server side. So we need an API that can help the user move through this state machine. And like the browser, HTML was great, but it's too verbose. We can do it more limited. So we can make a JSON version that contains just a few elements we need. We need actions. So we can do a get to the server and say, hey, how should we start this authentication? And the server will respond, hey, yes, you should render 2 fields that are input boxes. One is a username, one is password, and a button. That's the action. And when you click that, it should post here. And when that was done, you'll get a new thing to render. Why would we do that? Well, if we limit the hypermedia responses that we can do a native rendering of this in the UI. It could be generic. So the UI can understand that these are the types of elements that can occur, and we can use those to render the authentication flow. And then if an administrator or a business manager or something says, hey, we changed the terms of services, or we have an ongoing attack, you need to add this method now, enable the second or third factor on everybody. You can do that without redistributing the app, because the app is just a hypermedia client. It understands how to render these things because that's built in already. It doesn't need to know that this comes before that. That's up to the configuration of the OpenID Connect provider to give you. But we trusted the browser. So what do we do now? How do we trust this? Well, I think David mentioned it earlier. We use attestation to do that. We need to know that the app is who we think the app is. And luckily, things are happening a lot in this area. Both Android and iOS are providing better and better means for this. And there are great companies helping out with this as well, like Approve and others. We could wish for some standardization, of course, around this. But we need some attestation to trust who's calling. Because the first argument with OAuth and OpenID is that, well, we like the browser because then we know you're only entering your credentials or giving the credentials to the OpenID provider, the organization that wants the credentials, or that should have it at least. Yes, but like I said also, if you don't trust the app, we have other means for authentication. Maybe username password then shouldn't be used. Maybe we should be using WebAuth then, or some strong authentication app that context switches to. So we leave the app with nothing. It can't steal anything because the authentication isn't done there, but it still drives the flow. So depending if you're building a first-party app for your own organization or third-party app that others are building, you have to be able to have different factors. And now, finally, we have those. There are enough standards and enough ways to authenticate for this to be possible. So what we need now, the coming years after OAuth, after OpenID Connect, is to solve the hamburger problem. We need to figure out, how does this beef look like? And that is not just figuring out more authentication standards. It's to figure out how to drive authentication. That's the big problem. Not to do authentication, but to drive it, to move through the steps in a way that can be done natively on many platforms. And that's left outside. So we at Curity, we're building these things. We have an authentication API. We're seeking to standardize it. We would wish that the attestation part would be standardized as well. But what we need to do in all of these communities now is to start listening to the mobile developers and actually solve the UX problem. It's been 8 years since OAuth was since the inception of OAuth, and nothing really has happened. So we think it's time. Love to hear your thoughts on this. Shoot us an email or on Twitter, and let's have a conversation and move forward. Thank you.